I was reading comments in a video I did recently, and one Osman Nawadi 8068 on YouTube brought up something that I've dealt with so many times, and it's about the ethnicity of Ahmed Gurey. And he wrote a very long comment, and I'm going to read the comment, and then we are going to look at the question as to whether Ahmed Gurey was a Somali or he wasn't, because that's basically the issue he has with me here, is me saying that he was a Somali, and he thinks, and not just me, he thinks that very many people get it wrong. But before I do that, I need to also bring up something else that he mentions, and I need to accept that I think I made an error here. I mentioned that Arafaki, the author of Futuh al-Habasha, never accompanied Ahmed Gurey to Abyssinia. Turns out he did. He did actually. I think I was going as per the initial parts of the book where he mentions that he did interview very many people who knew Ahmed Gurey, and I think then it escaped my attention that actually he was talking about before he went to Abyssinia, and he actually did accompany Ahmed Gurey to Abyssinia. And I made that statement when I say that for you to understand the conflict between Abyssinia and Adal Sultanate, you'll get a better picture if you read Futuh al-Habasha, which is the story as told by people who are with Ahmed Gurey. And you also read the Portuguese expedition to Abyssinia, which is a book that was done by one Whiteway. He collected notes of Miguel Castahoso, who was actually also a soldier who accompanied or who fought alongside the Abyssinians during that conflict. And also Juan Jao Bermudez, who was, we could say, sort of a priest who accompanied or was embedded with the royal family of Abyssinia during that conflict. So I was making the point that for you to understand the war that went on between Abyssinia and Adal in the early 16th century, you should try to read the two books, because the two books gives you the perspectives of the two sides of that conflict. That's the point I was making. And then, of course, as I said, I made the error of saying that Shihab al-Adin Ahmed Rafaki, who wrote Futuh al-Habasha, did not accompany Ahmed Gurey. He did actually accompany Ahmed Gurey, and that is important, because then it says when you read these two books, you are reading text as written by somebody who was on the side of Ahmed Gurey or who accompanied Ahmed Gurey in the conflict. And when you read the Portuguese expedition, you are reading a book that was largely written by two individuals who were on the side of the Abyssinians and were involved in the conflict. And that will give you a very good picture. With that out of the way, let's come back to this. Let me read the entire comment first. This is the comment that Osman wrote. According to Shihab al-Adin Ahmed Arafaki, who was present, participated in the war, and accompanied Ahmed Garant or Ahmed Gurey. He was from the Haral tribe, not Somali. So he's saying Ahmed Gurey was not Somali. Somehow you are repeating that Ahmed Gurey was Somali. I've done that a few times. I do not mind if you are Somali because I'm Somali, but I hated to twist history. I do not mean you twisted history, but for sure Somalis have always twisted the history of Ahmed Gurey. Not only that, even the Sultan of Adal Somalis are called Somali, but in reality they were Arabs, not Somalis. Saad ad-Din the second and Walashma dynasty are not Somalis, but Somalis were the backbone of the sultans. They fought with the enemies like Abyssinian Christians and married each other and shared a lot of values. So that's the comment he left behind. And I think it raises very important questions or very important issues. And we need to interrogate these issues. And I think it can be very difficult today to try to understand these issues. But I'm going to try to get some picture from Arafaki's book Futuh al-Habasha, and also from Whiteway's the Portuguese expedition to Abyssinia. Now, Arafaki doesn't categorically say that Ahmed Gurey is a Somali. He does not do that. And he also does not say that Ahmed Gurey is of any other ethnicity. So he just leaves that question like that. He doesn't say he was this or he was that. He just calls him Imam, and then he talks about him throughout the book like that. But he does talk about the Somalis a lot, actually. And he even gives us the numbers of the different clans who formed part or the army of Ahmed Gurey. He does that very very early on in the book, and also later on he mentions the Somalis as the significant, actually, part or the significant portion of the army of Ahmed Gurey. Now, besides that, he also mentions other things. For example, he mentions that the sister of Ahmed Gurey, one Fardusa, was married to the Sultan, was married to a leader of a certain clan. This emir of the Somali clan of Giri, whose name is given as Garad Matan ibn Uthman, he was a brother-in-law to Ahmed Gurey. So that's the relative that is mentioned. There are other relatives that are actually mentioned, but they are not categorically described as being Somali. For example, the wife, Del Wanbara, is the daughter of one Mahfuz. The writer does not tell us whether Mahfuz was a Somali or not. It does not, so that remains like that. It's a question that is not answered. It is us who think of it as a question. I don't think Rafaki thought of it as an important detail. If he had thought of it as an important detail, he would have included that, but maybe from his perspective, it wasn't really an important issue to talk about. He mentions other relatives. Of course, the father of Ahmed Gurey, Imam Ahmed Gurey, talks about um, his brother Garadabun ibn Ibrahim, Muhammad bin Ibrahim. The brothers, those are two brothers. They are mentioned, but their ethnicity is never brought up. So that we can say Arab Faki leaves it like that. He mentions relatives besides actually the brother-in-law, who he clearly identifies as a Somali. He does not identify the others as to which ethnicity they belong to. Now, let's come to the Portuguese expedition to Abyssinia in 1541 to 1543. Now, this one does something different from what Futuh al-Habasha does when it comes to ethnicity of Ahmed Gurey and his army. I need to say that. When it comes to the army, while Futuh al-Habasha just lists the different Somali clans and tells us that this clan provided this number of soldiers, this one provided this number of soldiers, what this book does, and this book was published in 1902, I need to point out, but it gives us, or it is based on text, and it actually, besides the introduction, the other text was written in the same period that Futuh al-Habasha was written, 16th century. So we can say they come from the same era. When it comes to the army, while Futuh just gives us the list of the clans and the soldiers they provided, this book actually describes the army of Ahmed Gurey as a Somali army. That's how he described. Not once, I think several times I've seen he says the Somali army. So to Whiteway especially, it was a Somali army, and Bermudez and of course Castahoso. So that is important, that this book describes the army of Ahmed Gurey as a Somali army. Now, but when it comes to specifically the identity or the ethnicity of Ahmed Gurey, Whiteway writes something that is very interesting. And I'm going to read that part and we see what he says about the ethnicity of Ahmed Gurey. Because it seems like for him, he did consider, unlike Futuh al-Habasha or Arab Faki, who never thought of it as really an issue, Whiteway seems maybe not just Whiteway, but also Bermudez and Castahoso. To them, the ethnicity of Ahmed Gurey was something they considered. They at least thought about it or tried to investigate. More specifically, I can say Whiteway, the person who put this book together in 1902. Now, this is what he writes. Of the early history of the Imam Ahmad, but little is known. So he says very little is known about his life before he became the Imam. He was the son of one Ibrahim el-Ghazi, and both he and his father were common soldiers in the troops of the Gerard Abun. Faki also writes the same. Actually, this information matches what is written in Futuh al-Habasha by Arab Faki. Then he continues, nothing even is said to his nationality, which is an interesting way to put it, I might say, because he was in the Adal Sultanate, so I think he should have said ethnicity maybe. Nationality and ethnicity are not the same thing per se. They often are the same thing, but not necessarily. That's what I'm saying. So by saying nationality, obviously he was a leader of Adal, so we can say belonged there. Now he continues, he was certainly not an Arab. So Whiteway seems like he's very confident, but that Imam Ahmed Gurey was not an Arab. He's so firm on that. Probably was a Somali, for we find him closely connected with many who were Somalis. So now this second part, while he's so confident that he was not an Arab, he's not so sure whether he was a Somali, but he says that most likely he was a Somali. That's the much we can get from this book. So where does that leave us after looking at what Arafaki writes in Futuh al-Habasha and what Whiteway writes in the introduction in the expedition, the Portuguese expedition? It kind of leaves us not really being sure, not really being sure. So anything could be. It could be that he was actually a Somali, but there is also a possibility that he wasn't. He was one, because remember, the Adal Sultanate was not just Somali. It included other people. It included other, could be smaller, call them tribe, a word I don't really like using, but we can use it for this context. There were other smaller tribes, maybe smaller, maybe larger, but there were other tribes, that's for sure, that formed the Adal Sultanate. There were also Arabs, actually. It's also a fact. Faki himself was an Arab. There were also Persians. They are mentioned actually by in this book by Bermudez and Castahoso. They are mentioned that there were Arabs who were actually fighting on the side of Ahmed Gurey, and others also actually fighting on the right on the side of the Abyssinians, which I found to be very interesting. Arabs and Turks. So this war, just like any other war, is a little bit more nuanced than we come to think of it, because when we think of it, sometimes we don't imagine there were Turks and there were Arabs and Persians who were fighting on the side of the Abyssinians. But turns out there were actually, when you read these books, especially this by Castahoso and Bermudez, there were those people. So it was more complex. All wars are always complex. Now, anyways, there were Arabs, there were Persians, there were Turks, there were all these people in the Horn of Africa. So, which leaves a lot of possibilities on the table. So, yeah, so Whiteway writes the introduction. He was most likely a Somali. Arafaki doesn't tell us about that. He says nothing, remains silent on that. Whiteway writes that, and Bermudez and Castahoso write that the army of Ahmed Gurey was a Somali army. Uh, Meanwhile, Arafaki does not identify it like that, that is a Somali army. He identifies it just as army of God. And that's how he sees it. That's how he portrays it in the book. And so, yeah, so there's still so many questions that remain unanswered. Maybe there are other books out there that mm, bring a clearer picture, or paint a clearer picture about the ethnicity of Ahmed Gurey, but I've not come across such a book. You can actually get the two books. Check my pinned comment and also the description box if you are watching on YouTube. And if you are watching on TikTok, check my profile bio. You'll get a link that will take you to where these books can be found, and you can get physical copies actually, and then you can read for yourself. Those are my random thoughts.